So we're all set. Thanks very much for having me. This is a really exciting and interesting class, I think, and I think you're probably learning a lot of interesting things here that you wouldn't necessarily learn in another forum on the campus. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes here about poverty in the United States and make a few policy observations. A lot of these are really broad and general, but I think they're a way of setting a context for what our other speakers are going to talk about, where we'll talk about the state and local conditions with regard to poverty as well. Just kind of an outline of what I'm going to do here. I'm going to talk about the measurement of poverty briefly, changing poverty trends, myths about poverty in America, some of which seem to be long-standing and very persistent, a brief discussion of changes in poverty policy, a couple of observations about the relationship between the middle class and poverty policy, and then finally I'll say a few things about the future of poverty policy, and then it'll be time for me to sit down. So we'll stop right there. So let's start with a kind of a central observation. Poverty in the United States is not measured very well. So when we talk about policies directed toward Group X, whatever the group is, it's actually rather nice if Group X is defined fairly precisely. With regard to poverty policy and poverty in general, we don't measure poverty very well. Our measure of poverty was established in the early 1960s. At that time, family poverty was calculated by assuming that if a family spent 1/3 of their income on food, they were poor. The poverty rate was simply evolved by finding groups of people who spent 1/3 of their income on food, and whatever that income was became the poverty rate. That poverty rate was adjusted for the consumer price index basically ever since then. So that's how we have come up with the poverty rate in the United States, the long-standing one. Now there have been different attempts to adjust this that we'll talk about here in a second. What this has done is it's produced a situation where the poverty rate is calculated on a national basis and looks pretty much like you see in this table. This is provided by the National Center for Children in Poverty. So if you look, for example, for a family of 4, the poverty threshold is set at $21,200 now, which doesn't, on the face of it, seem very high to me. We actually pay teaching and research assistants here in most departments more than that for half-time work, and they have better benefits and everything else. So, and the poverty rate changes based on the family composition, with each additional person in the family who had $3,600 to the top. These are defined as of 2008, so these are reasonably current dollar figures. The National Academy of Sciences in 1995 spent a fair amount of time, actually, examining how poverty was measured and making recommendations for fairly systematic changes, and talked extensively about creating new poverty thresholds that reflected the cost of food and clothing and shelter as those exist now, and to adjust the thresholds by region and regional cost of living. Now, those were two rather elementary recommendations that seemed to make sense, and there were some others as well, such as using post-tax family income rather than pre-tax family income, since virtually all families pay taxes, and to include things like earned income tax credits and the value of other near-cash benefits like food stamps and housing assistance. But then the National Academy of Sciences also recommended something else, and that was that work-related expenses be subtracted from that income level, things like child care and transportation to work. The result would be a fairly drastic change in how poverty was measured. This measure has basically never been adopted, or not been adopted on a widespread basis, but represents the standard social scientific thinking at this point regarding how poverty should be measured. We look at some trends here, and this might be a tad too small. Here we have a Census Bureau estimate of number of people in the United States and the poverty rate from 1959 to 2008. You'll notice the poverty rate stays more or less the same, somewhere around 13% or so. The shaded areas here are recessions. So the poverty rate almost always goes up slightly in a recession, then goes down slightly afterward, but the poverty rate has been pretty steady for quite a long time and actually dropped very significantly around 1959, 1960 for reasons that will be apparent here in a second. One of the reasons for showing this slide is to point out something that I think has been pointed out in a prior class here, for sure, maybe the one I sat in on last week. One of the things we've done quite effectively during the 20th century is we've changed the demographic composition of who is poor rather drastically. And what we have done is we have gone from a society where the poor were primarily or predominantly elderly, 65 years and older, to a situation where the poor are primarily children, 18 years and under. And this is a direct result of the Social Security Act and the Social Security system. So we actually made a conscious policy choice, whether we realized it or not, to change the composition of who was poor by neglect of children and paying relative attention to the elderly. So let's talk about some common myths about poverty here, since I'm sort of a table setter here. Most of the poor are African Americans. Yes. Wrong. Most of the poor are white. Both numerically for sure, percentage terms slightly below 50%. It is emphatically true that most of the poor are not African Americans. The poor don't work. They don't have jobs. Actually, the average person who has a poverty line income has 1.7 jobs. They have more jobs than I've got. I've only got one. Can't do mine very well, but I've got it. Those with full-time jobs are not poor. Actually, 1 in 5 people with a full-time job doesn't make an income above the poverty line. So even full-time work is not necessarily a guarantee that one won't be classified as poor or have an income below the poverty line. Poor women, this is a good one, poor women have more children to get bigger welfare checks. That's an awful lot of pain to go through for an average of about 60 bucks. They work a couple of days in a fast food restaurant and make that up. Or how about this one? Women wouldn't be in poverty if they would just get married. Well, that's fine if they would marry 2.3 men of similarly situated economic condition. So we need to legalize polyandry. Why do I say that? Because marriage in the United States, as in most industrialized countries, is becoming an assortive process. People marry people of the same economic class they're from. These women are not going to be sitting on a downtown street corner and have some guy pull up in a Mercedes and say, "Gee, you look like a good candidate. Just get in. I'll sweep you off of your feet." Poverty is a permanent condition. Poverty is actually not, for most people, a permanent condition. Very large numbers of people in the United States fall in and out of poverty status over the course of their lifetime. So a surprising number of people in the United States, especially as children, spend at least a portion of their life being classified as poor. Final common myth: most of those classified as poor receive public assistance of some kind. Actually, only around half of them do. About half of the people who are poor don't receive public assistance of any kind. There are actually some interesting social action experiments done in the early 1970s to sort of display this dramatically. One of these was conducted by Francis Piven and Richard Cloward, who were social work professors at Columbia University. Francis Piven ended up being president of the American Sociological Association. And there was a news piece about whether or not there were too many people on public assistance, and so Piven and Cloward took their social welfare graduate class and sent them out in the streets to ask people questions. And they would go from person to person and look for people who were a little down on their luck. And they would ask them a few questions about their income and where they're working. And then they would say, gee, it seems as if you qualify for these programs for public assistance. Please show up at this welfare office on this date at this time. The secret to the experiment, they tell everyone to show up on exactly the same date, at exactly the same time, with the television camera that's rolling. So several thousand people show up who are receiving no public assistance at all, and there's a picture of it. So there are various theories about why this is so, by the way. A couple of other interesting stats before we sort of conclude and move on here. Well, it is true that the predominant racial and ethnic group that are poor are white. It is not true that most white people are poor or that most white children are poor. These are poverty rates by racial and ethnic group. And you'll see that there's quite wide variation there. It's in 2006 data. Do you look at the composition of poor children? So you look at the group of children that's poor, and the composition changes quite drastically. And again, you're to a position where the plurality of children that are poor are white ethnicity. Something we sometimes forget, given that we're defining poverty at a relatively low level and kind of arbitrarily, is how many people are near poor, or how many people make an income that is within 200% of the poverty line. And these green bars sort of represent that total for children at different ages. So among children under 3 in the United States in 2007, some 43%, 5.4 million, live in homes within 200% of the poverty line. And the number actually goes down as children get older. Since poverty is not measured very well, and there's widespread dissatisfaction on a number of fronts about how poverty is measured, different groups have attempted to essentially engage in attempts to change poverty measurement to head in the direction of some variety of a basic needs budget. And this is kind of one example of that. So here we have the National Center for Children in Poverty's basic needs budget for New York City, Houston, Texas, Aurora, Illinois, it's essentially suburban Chicago, and, as luck would have it, Decatur County, Iowa. So these are estimates of what utilities and other expenses would be, and what the minimal level would be, minimal level income would be for a basic, what's called a basic needs budget. Now, what's interesting about this basic needs budget is it's just like other calculations of poverty. What is interesting is to read the fine print. So I'll read the fine print here. This budget assumes a 2-parent family. There's 1 preschool-age children and 1 school-age child. So we have a family of 4. The results are based on the following assumptions. Children are in center-based care settings while their parents work. The older child is in after-school care. Family members have access to employer-based health insurance. What did we talk about last week? Interesting. In New York City, the family relies on public transportation. In all other locations, costs reflect private transportation. And then there's an estimate of how much above the federal poverty level these different values would be. So, and this is only one of many calculations that are done like this that sort of reflect widespread dissatisfaction with how poverty is measured. Well, a few minutes on a basic history of poverty policy, and boy, this is the Cliff Notes version. There are versions that are a lot more detailed than this, that include a lot more events and activities. This is basically a fast one. But if we start with New Deal poverty policy, the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, develops poverty policy that basically centers on providing income security for the aged and providing various sorts of temporary work for people who are out of work, work-based relief. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other so-called alphabet programs that the Roosevelt administration creates, all in one way or another take the unemployed, put them to work, give them either a government job directly or a heavily subsidized private sector job, and attempt to not only relieve poverty that way, but to pump money in the economy and to get the economy to recover. New Deal is also known for the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, that guarantees unions the right to organize. And probably the biggest enduring legacy here, Social Security, or what was defined at the time OASDI, the Old Age Survivors and Disability Income Program, designed to cover not only the aged, but the disabled, orphans and widows, and a variety of other people using a wage-based contribution plan as social insurance. And then finally, the 1930s brought us AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which remains in place almost unhindered from 1935 until welfare reform in 1996. So this is an area of big activity. It puts a lot of U.S. basic anti-poverty policy in place. There are two books between the 1930s and the 1970s that in many ways define the intellectual path that anti-poverty policy in the United States will take. Not necessarily in the sense that people are completely bowled over by these things, but in the sense that they have a lot of influence. One of these that I don't think gets enough credit is Michael Harrington's 1959 piece, The Other America. Right after World War II, we think we're on top of the world. We have defeated the Axis powers. We're sending a bunch of mostly men, but also women to college on the GI Bill. They're having babies like there's no tomorrow. All of that's going on. Harrington comes back and essentially says, well, about somewhere between a third and a half of you are ill-clad, ill-housed, and live at levels that are below the poverty line. A rather interesting and shocking statement at the time. Second piece would be Daniel Moynihan's The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, written in 1965, which talks about, rather extensively, about what he sees as the long-term effects of pervasive poverty, and describes them in racial terms, which ends up being one of the defining features of the welfare state in the United States over the long term. Move forward to the 1960s, we have the War on Poverty and the Great Society. The War on Poverty adopts many of the recommendations from the National Advisory Committee on Civil Disorder, which is a federal commission that's put together after early 1960s urban riots in major cities. It includes the Economic Opportunity Act, Medicaid, which you talked about some last week, and a patchwork of state and local additions and subtractions. What the War on Poverty focuses mostly on is community engagement, community development, and block grants to community organizations, in addition to the Medicare program. After this, there's a period of stagnation for a while. However, there's a rather interesting interlude. So last week there was Nixon's attempt at health care reform. Here we have, in the late 1960s, the Nixon administration's failed family assistance plan that would replace, in effect, aid to families with dependent children with a negative income tax scheme. Negative income tax schemes, to make a long story short, define a minimum family or individual income. If you make less than that income, the government pays you. If you make more than that income, you pay them. And there's usually some sliding scale in the middle that phases out over some duration to limit work disincentives in the middle. This dies for many of the same reasons. A lot of social policy at the time dies in the United States. Resistance from Southern Democrats and resistance from some Republicans as well. By this time, welfare is identified as an African American problem, and we're not going to help those people. So, 1975 sees the creation of the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is probably the most popular poverty-fighting tool to date. There's not a God-fearing politician on United States soil that will say a bad thing about the Earned Income Tax Credit, at least in public. Initially designed to offset payroll taxes, basically works as a sliding scale refund, so that the tax refund you get is a refund plus some other amount that's added onto it that compensates for your relatively low income. The Earned Income Tax Credit in 2009 starts as a 45% enhancement to what you make, plateaus somewhere between $12,000 and $16,000, and then slowly phases out to zero when you hit $40,295. So a very directly administered incomes-based program done more or less automatically by the Internal Revenue Service. All you have to do is claim it, check comes in the mail. Very popular. Then we have welfare reform, or what is actually known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996. So in 1996, we replace AFDC with TAMF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. We limit receipt of TAMF to 5 years. We tie the receipt of benefits to active labor market activity and working. And to some extent, most analysts say this is a response to several things: frustrations over the way AFDC is used, but also a response to the changing demographics of poverty. In the 1930s, most of the poor were widows and children and the elderly. By the 1990s, the poor represent people that are viewed as demographically, shall we say, less attractive for a variety of reasons. There's a whole series of things I could say about the middle class and poverty that I will not say, in part because they're laid out in the post-industrial peasants chapters I gave you. I think it's safe to say that since about the late 1970s or so, the middle class have not been in a giving mood. And that's about all I'll say about that, since my time's almost running out. So, given that there's widespread discontent with how poverty is measured, and to some extent there's widespread discontent with poverty policy, what we do and what we spend on it, where do we go from here? What are the types of things that policy analysts talk about as ways of changing our poverty policy system? Most analysts of various stripes talk about a variety of things. One of the things that's very clear that most analysts talk about is, in the United States, we really value work. So what we really ought to be doing, if we're interested in alleviating poverty, is to heavily subsidize work activity, to make work pay. If you have a full-time job, you're not going to be poor. If you have a full-time job and you're poor, that's violating our ideological conception of what the work ethic is about. People who work should be rewarded. So people who work should, in theory, not be in poverty. And there are various mechanisms for doing that. Some talk about expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit and making it more generous, providing some form of universal health care, at least of last resort, so that employers are not held on the hook, and to otherwise extensively subsidize wage workers, and to give employers some incentive to do so. At present, we have almost no tax breaks for creating jobs at all. In fact, if you read the federal tax code, there are actually a bunch of them bunch of tax incentives that exist for destroying jobs. In fact, there are more for destroying jobs than there are for creating jobs, but that's for another talk. Somewhat more controversial, and I'll leave you with this. There have been more recent analyses done between basically 1999 and now that talk about whether or not we actually do have a labor market policy in the United States. They're prisons. Western European nations spend money on welfare. We spend money on prisons. How much money do we spend on prisons? So much that if we spent the money on welfare, no one would be poor. So perhaps prisons are our labor market regulation system, as Bruce Western would put it. And part of the way of seeing this is look at the number of people we incarcerate per 100,000 people in the United States, higher than any industrialized nation in the world. Look at that rate for United States African Americans, 1,947 per 100,000. Not very good. But then what's interesting is what happens to our unemployment rate if you count everyone who's incarcerated as unemployed. Rather than counting them as out of the labor force, count them as unemployed. If you do that, our unemployment rate in 1995 would rise from 5.6% to, under some assumptions, 7.5%. Solidly in the middle of where Western European unemployment rates are. And remember, their labor markets don't work. We're told that they don't work all the time, right? Why? There's high unemployment. Why? You have to pay $13.50 to get a Burger King Whopper. Who would want to do that? This particular thesis is pretty provocative, but I think it's worth, I'm not sure I entirely agree with it either, but it's worth thinking about a little. We spend a lot of money on prisons. We don't spend a lot of money on helping the poor. Maybe the prison is simply a poorhouse. And with that, I'll stop and pass things on to our other presenters. So, thanks very much.